Good morning. It falls to me to introduce this conference with an overarching theme broad enough to encompass everything from literally DNA molecules to elephants, with a stop at Homeland Security along the way. And so what I'd like to do in the next 30 minutes or so is to step back from the fray, as much as it's ever in my nature to do that, and ask what we really understand about how and why humans and dogs ended up together as we have. Now, if that proverbial, overworked, but still useful, hypothetical visitor from outer space, the man from Mars, were to arrive on our planet today, and if he were, for our purposes, a trained wildlife ecologist sent to carry out a biological survey of life on Earth, I honestly think that nothing would strike him as odder or more interesting than the hundreds of millions of dogs that have succeeded in beguiling another species to care, feed, nurture, and dote upon them, often with precious little in return. And I think that as a good evolutionary biologist, he'd feel himself honor-bound to come up with at least a plausible biological explanation for how such a remarkable interspecies bond came to be. He might be tempted, as a first guess, to view dogs as remarkably successful social parasites, and I'm not sure he'd be entirely wrong as a first approximation in that conclusion. But the full story is deeper and certainly more interesting and full of twists and turns that I think reveal much about the richness and peculiarities of both of our species. There's a lot we take for granted that we probably shouldn't about this interspecies bond. Now, a brief word about my background before I begin. As some of you may know, I concentrate mainly on history these days in my writing, but a few years ago, I wrote a number of books about animals, as Patty mentioned, and the evolution of domestication, and dogs in particular. And if you're wondering why I, as an author in search of a topic, as authors always are, of course, decided to write about dogs, the explanation is actually quite simple. They say, write what you know. And so there I am. And so this was the result. My book, The Truth About Dogs. Books about the other major pet groups I've written, Character of Cats, The Nature of Horses. And by the way, just to reassure you that I do know what I'm talking about, I can offer no better evidence than my first name. This was a cartoon that appeared in the London Sunday Times pointing out the incontrovertible truth that all great science writers are named Steve. Steve Pinker, Stephen Hawking, Stephen Jay Gould, and I don't know if you can see the little thought bubble in the guy at the checkout at the bookstore here, but he's saying if he's called Steve, he must know what he's talking about. And I actually make a cameo appearance in here, too. So I don't want to hear any questions about my credentials while I'm here. Well, now that we've got that out of the way, the traditional view of domestication that has held sway for as long as people have been thinking about domestication has tended to cast it as a brilliant human invention. And it seems obvious, probably even today, to most people that humans invented domestication, just as they invented the wheel, movable type, saran wrap, credit default swaps, and other brilliant ideas we've come up with over the eons. But there are actually many reasons to be extremely dubious about the idea that human intentionality was the sole or even the primary driving force for such a remarkable biological process. For one thing, there's the fact that out of about 4,000 species of mammals, 10,000 species of birds, only a handful have ever become domesticated. Here's a snapshot summary of the successfully domesticated species from the major orders. Red is the total number of species in each order. Blue is the number of domestic species. It's surprisingly small. And you know, it wasn't for want of trying or experience. The ancient Egyptians, who were certainly well versed in the mysteries of animal husbandry, kept and even originated many domestic species, including the cat, cattle, geese. Yet they tried and failed to domesticate ibexes, gazelles, hyenas, antelopes, big cats, cranes. And so, they were experienced herdsmen, keepers of animals. There was no obvious reason these species shouldn't have become domesticated too. They didn't. Dogs pose an especially interesting conundrum on this score because the oldest fossil remains of what's indisputably a dog go back well before the dawn of agriculture, well before the age of human experience and domestication to at least some 15,000 years ago. Genetic evidence, which is the date shown in red here for the dog, suggests that dogs may well have begun to branch off from wolves much earlier, as much as 135,000 years ago. Now, 135,000 years ago was the time when a lot of humans who were around were Neanderthals, who would be this guy on a good day. No comments about any resemblance to your speaker, please. So you're seeing clear biological changes in a proto-domestic species in association with humans, but these were humans who still, for the most part, had another 30,000 years to go before they would acquire chins, 70,000 years before they could speak, 100,000 years before they would begin to make pottery or begin farming, 125,000 years until they would learn to write and build cities, and 134,900 years until they would invent dog food. And the other monkey wrench in the idea of intentionality as a primary explanation for domestication is that in many ways the supposedly useful properties of domestic animals were not even manifest in their wild precursors. And even more daunting is the fact that domestication was and continues to be accompanied by considerable costs. There's the outright direct economic costs of modern dog ownership. This is actually an average for the US, which means some people spend a lot more a year. I was interested that all of the miscellaneous dog junk is actually one of the largest categories beyond veterinary care. And then there's the indirect costs of damage, destruction, dog bites. Dogs in the United States actually bite more than 1 million people a year seriously enough to require medical attention. Insurance companies pay out more than $500 million a year to settle claims from dog bites. And then there's, and remember please, I'm speaking as the biological, man from Mars here, trying to understand what's going on. Dogs are also the reservoirs of more than 65 diseases that can be passed to humans, including coccidiosis, liver flukes, roundworm species, trypanosomiasis, E. coli, rabies, ringworm. Well, it's interesting that for all of our self-regard as man the inventor, man the captain of his own destiny, most dogs in the world today remain unowned. Most are regarded in most parts of the world as unwanted nuisances that spread disease and are considered unclean, yet they survive in association with humans, not because of human intent, but in spite of human intent. Well, all of this helped to prompt some interesting speculative thinking about a half century ago, notably by the famous ethologist Konrad Lorenz, about why we might instinctively be drawn to animals and want to raise and nurture them despite what might rationally be calculated to be in our biological best interest. Lorenz did some famous experiments on what he termed rather, I think, unnecessarily, cumbersomely innate releasing mechanisms, which simply meant that he found that in many species, particularly when it comes to instincts associated with parental behavior, there were certain typically visual stimuli that unleashed automatic behavioral responses, even in clearly inappropriate situations and scenarios. Geese, for example, were found to instinctively react to an egg-shaped object outside of their nest, and they would try to retrieve it to the nest and would do so even with ridiculously large fake eggs. Similarly, Lorenz proposed that there were certain basic characteristics of a human infant's face: a large head, big eyes, shortened features, large forehead, that released instinctive parental reactions in humans. And these same instinctive parental reactions could coincidentally be triggered by the young of other species that shared those basic characteristics. The inherent cuteness we find in juvenilized forms, regardless of species, and in situations even where it's detached from any reasonable biologically adaptive purpose, extends, even as Stephen Jay Gould showed, to cartoon characters. He traced the evolution of Mickey Mouse from a rather sinister-looking adult character with beady eyes and a long nose to an increasingly juvenilized form over the years that undeniably became more appealing as his nose got flattened, his eyes bigger, his forehead longer. And since we're all scientists here, you don't have to take my word for it, here's a graph that Stephen Jay Gould did of Mickey's evolution. The rectangles on the right are the characteristics of Morty, Mickey's young nephew, and we can see over time Mickey is becoming more like Morty and increasingly juvenile. And I was looking for other examples. It's happening everywhere. Here's the Michelin Man back in the 30s, and he was this sort of man of the world, cigar-smoking roue, and in fact in one poster, which I couldn't find a good copy of, but it was great. They're bent over the handlebars with his cigar, sort of bicycling like a demon, and he's got this luscious lass on the back of his bicycle with her skirts flowing, being pursued at this moon over. Anyway, this is what he's become. He's become this Google-eyed homunculus now with the cute face, juvenilized forms at work again. And so, by this line of thinking, people might have initially been drawn to wolf puppies and brought them into human camps, and over time, this human preference for the cute might have reinforced the attraction of dogs via selective pressures that favored increasingly juvenile-like appearances in the dogs that we chose as pets, and that would tend to retain, that for whatever reasons, retained into adulthood these foreshortened features and so on. And studies that were done fairly early on by ethnologists of primitive societies, such as the Aborigines of Australia, documented the frequent practice of adopting wild baby animals. The trouble is that these same studies also pretty clearly showed that most often these wild animal babies would be played with and tied up in camp and then would die in a few days from neglect or lack of proper feeding. And I think, in fact, there is again a strong case against even cuteness as being the basis of a convincing explanation that retains a strong component of human intentionality in the process. This was an interesting recent study on the problem of unsuccessful dog ownership in Taiwan, where there's been a lot of increase in dog ownership and a huge increase in dogs being abandoned or euthanized because they didn't work out. And this study was done analyzing the various risk factors in unsuccessful dog ownership. And one of the most significant ones was owners thinking their dog is cute. Adopting the dog as a puppy also was a significant risk factor, much more so than the things you might think, such as unsatisfactory training, aggressive behavior, barking, or other problems. And this thinking the dog is cute apparently because of the unrealistic expectations it may have created, was, as I said, a significant risk factor in the dog not working out. Well, another way to look at this, though, is to say, well, regardless of how the first crucial steps on the road to domestication took place, dogs did prove to be useful over time, and that was the enduring basis of their flourishing in the company of man and in forging the basis of an enduring canine-human relationship. And certainly we can point to examples that have survived even into the industrial age of dogs' utility in a variety of specialized roles. Part of the basic process of domestication of the dog clearly has been the disruption, reordering, and fragmentation of ancestral wolf hunting behaviors. And there's certainly no disputing the fact that going back hundreds of years, dogs were beginning to be bred deliberately by humans to further select for and emphasize the more useful of these ancestral wolf behavior components. Going back to Roman times, there are written descriptions of specialized dogs, such as shepherd dogs, scent hounds, sight hounds, war dogs, and guard dogs.